Bien, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Raimundo Pérez Hernández, director de la Fundación Ramón Areces, en nombre de cuyo patronato les doy una cariñosísima bienvenida a un acto que hoy para nosotros es muy importante. Una bienvenida que hago extensiva a todos los asistentes. Les agradezco enormemente que estén hoy presencialmente con nosotros. Y no puedo destacar a todo el mundo, pero quisiera destacar al ministro Joaquín Almunia, gran amigo y colaborador de esta fundación, al coronel Costelludo, experto en protocolo del Estado, y a otros muchos amigos. Una bienvenida también muy especial a José María Beneito, catedrático de Derecho Internacional Público, Jean Monnet, y también colaborador permanente de esta fundación y artífice de lo que hoy estamos viviendo aquí. A warm welcome to Elaine Papulias also. Where is she? She must be waiting for the American ambassador, Executive Director of Minda Gunselbuch Center for European Studies at Harvard University. Y, por supuesto, una gran bienvenida al profesor Daniel Ziblatt, Catedrático Eaton de Gobierno de la Universidad de Harvard, cuya conferencia ha sido organizada en colaboración estrecha con el Centro de Estudios Europeos. Precisamente hoy, y por eso digo que este es un día importante para la Fundación, hemos ratificado el acuerdo de colaboración entre la Universidad de Harvard y la Fundación Ramón Areces, que se concretará en 3 ámbitos principales. Un programa de fellowship que financiará la Fundación Ramón Areces para un becario español que estudiará y trabajará en el Centro de Estudios Europeos. Un ciclo, en segundo lugar, un ciclo de conferencias anuales con profesores de dicho campus y otros profesores investigadores asociados al Centro de Estudios Europeos. Y, por último, un programa, un workshop de... May I say a warm welcome to the American ambassador. Thank you for coming. Y un seminario que esperamos que sea de mucho calado, cuyos temas serán de interés absoluto sobre todos los temas de política exterior, de relaciones internacionales, de economía internacional o de arquitectura europea. Como verán, se trata de un programa ambicioso de intercambio en un campo académico como el de las relaciones internacionales, la política exterior, la construcción europea o la arquitectura de seguridad en la actualidad en Europa, en la que la Fundación Ramón Areces va a adentrarse con las mejores colaboraciones posibles para ampliar su red de oferta de interés y prioridades. Hablando de colaboraciones con otras instituciones, es política de la Fundación establecer acuerdos estratégicos con los principales centros de excelencia del mundo, tanto en el ámbito de las ciencias de la vida y la materia, como en el ámbito de las ciencias sociales y las humanidades. Precisamente mañana tendrá lugar en esta sede, a las 4 de la tarde, comenzará un seminario internacional organizado por la Fundación en colaboración estrecha con el MIT sobre el futuro de la movilidad. Destacados profesores del MIT nos harán llegar el conocimiento de la vanguardia científica y tecnológica en un tema tan trascendental para la sociedad moderna como es el de la movilidad y su futuro. Por todo ello, podrán comprender ustedes que estamos encantados de poder presentar a la sociedad española lo más nuevo, las últimas tendencias y los últimos desarrollos en ámbitos de un enorme interés para todos nosotros. Creemos, en efecto, que con la aceleración histórica, económica y tecnológica que vivimos, es no solo importante, sino imprescindible, estar no solo al día, sino a la última hora de lo que ocurre en el mundo. Muchísimas gracias por venir con nosotros y le doy la palabra al profesor José María Beneito, auténtico artífice de la reunión que nos convoca. Muchas gracias.
Muy buenas tardes a todos, bienvenidos. Un gran placer poder estar aquí, poder introducir, hacer una pequeña presentación de la conferencia que vamos a tener inmediatamente, Quiero dar también una bienvenida muy cordial a la embajadora, buena amiga, al comisario Almunia y a los otros amigos que se han acercado, algunos de ellos conocidos desde la época de nuestros estudios y estancias en la propia Universidad de Harvard. Hoy tenemos uno de los grandes autores de ciencia política en el mundo. Una de las personas que ha sabido, junto con su colaborador Steve Levitsky, verdaderamente dar en el centro de una cuestión de tanta actualidad y tanta complejidad como es la crisis de la democracia. Y lo han hecho desde una perspectiva comparada, de una perspectiva analítica, de ciencia política, teniendo en cuenta también la historia. Tenemos una historia en Europa donde hemos visto en el periodo de entreguerras cómo se produce una erosión progresiva hasta llegar a total crisis de las democracias. Tenemos un aprendizaje histórico. Estos autores, el profesor Daniel Ziblatt, han sido capaces de aplicar todo este conocimiento al momento que vivimos y hacerlo en esa perspectiva comparada. El profesor Daniel Ziblatt es profesor Eaton de Gobierno en la Universidad de Harvard, se doctoró en la Universidad de Berkeley, es también el director de un programa en el Centro Científico de Berlín, una entidad especializada muy conocida en el mundo de las ciencias sociales, precisamente en temas relacionados con ciencia política, pero en particular con el desarrollo de las democracias. Y es también, yo creo que podemos ya anunciarlo, el director a partir de enero del año que viene del Center for European Studies de la Universidad de Harvard, después de una larga dirección a cargo de otro gran colega, profesor Gregor Ekiats, que tuvimos la oportunidad de tener aquí en la Fundación también no hace mucho tiempo y que ha estado al frente del Center for European Studies durante un buen periodo de tiempo. El Center es una institución verdaderamente única por su interdisciplinaridad, por ser Europa en el centro del campus de la Universidad de Harvard, para los que pues, al comienzo de nuestra vida académica tuvimos la oportunidad de pasar tiempo en el Center for European Studies y de estudiar con algunos de sus grandes maestros, como fue Stanley Hoffman y otros, pues nos hemos quedado siempre de alguna manera vinculados al Center y por eso este nuevo programa que iniciamos con la Fundación Ramón Areces pues es una oportunidad verdaderamente de volver a vincular España, Madrid, con el Center for European Studies de la Universidad de Harvard. Quiero agradecer de manera muy particular al director de la Fundación, el embajador Raimundo Pérez Hernández, por toda su amabilidad, por haber asumido desde el primer momento, haber tenido la iniciativa y haber asumido todo el proyecto que hoy empezamos. Y de una manera muy particular también a Ailén Papulias, la directora ejecutiva del Center for European Studies, que ha sido en todo momento una fuerza y una energía para poder llevar a cabo el inicio de este programa. Sin más, voy a dar la palabra al profesor Ziblatt, que va a hablar, como bien dice el título, ¿está en crisis la democracia y qué se puede hacer al respecto? Muchas gracias.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Professor Benito, also to the Foundation, Ambassador Perez Hernandez, Commissioner and Ambassador. It's wonderful that you could join this evening. It's really a great honor to be here and to I have a loud voice. Oh, here we go. Wonderful. Thank you. So I want to begin by saying that there is really a consensus, I would say, that today that global democracy is under threat. The global democracy is in crisis. Democratic backsliding seems to be rampant everywhere from Venezuela to Hungary to India. And suddenly, unexpectedly, some of the world's oldest democracies in Europe and North America face enormous challenges. So what I want to do today in my time is to zero in on what I think is one particular challenge, and namely the rise of exclusionary political parties that are often anti-democratic, both in Europe and in North America. And I really want to make two main points. The first is slightly counterintuitive, and that is that the challenges, the roots of these challenges in democracies today comes from a surprising source. It comes from political establishments that are weakening. This is one major factor, I think, in what's happening. In a sense, these political establishments are becoming more inclusive, one could say, but this paradoxically opens the door to illiberal forces. So that's one point. The second point I want to make is that although this problem is common to all democracies, I actually think European democracies, at least in the western part of Europe, seem to be better capable at the moment of dealing with these challenges. And so I want to think about why that's the case. So to start at the top, we all know about the rise of illiberal political parties in established democracies. You can think of Trump in the United States, Salvini, Le Pen, the Austrian Freedom Party, the AfD in Germany. Now, the rise of this illiberalism has gotten a lot of attention, but the bulk of the attention has focused on what I can kind of think of as the demand side of politics. That is why voters are turning to these kinds of political parties. Many scholars focus on economic causes. They highlight the failure of established parties to deal with the challenges of slowed economic growth, rising economic inequality, slowed economic mobility, intergenerational mobility. Other scholars point to the importance of culture, ethnicity, race, immigration, and point out that Europeans and Americans are dealing with new populations in their midst and increasing diversification, which is a great opportunity, of course, for all societies. But it's also the case, as Steve Levitsky and I make the case in our book, that the reaction of the dominant, previously dominant, often white majorities in countries to this is often what's compelling or driving a lot of the processes of polarization and norm erosion. So there's a sense that cultures are under siege. Now, these standard kind of demand-side explanations of what's happening, I think, highlight a lot of what's going on. But I think there's also an important supply side to the story, to keep with the analogy. And that supply side story is essentially that it's much easier today to be an electorally successful, illiberal authoritarian than it was, let's say, in the 1950s or 60s. And that is because political establishments are weakening across the globe. Now, what do I mean by political establishment? Well, I'll give you a simple definition. Political establishment is the collection of organizations and actors that control the resources that politicians need to get elected and sustain a political career. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll just mention three types of establishment organizations. One is political parties, which are important to politicians because they control access to candidacy. Another is business, labor, and other interest groups, which are critical sources of finance and organization at campaign time. And third is major media outlets, so television stations, newspapers, which are the principal means by which politicians gain access to voters. Now, political parties, interest groups, media, these obviously do not constitute a single monolith or a block in any democracy. There's lots of pluralism and competition among them. But they've historically imposed certain boundaries, both in terms of policies, ideas, and political style. So politicians who exceed those boundaries, those who violate basic norms of democracy, who often push extremist politics, tend to be shunned by the establishment. Party leaders won't nominate them for office. Union leaders won't back them. And mainstream media won't cover them, or at least will cover them in a negative way. Now, over the last half century, this mattered a lot because political establishments essentially maintained a monopoly over the resources that politicians needed to get elected. Now, back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in most of Western Europe, party leaders dominated the candidate selection process. So there were no primaries in most democracies for selecting candidates for political party leadership. A relatively small number of interest groups provided the bulk of finance and other campaigns, so business groups, labor unions. And a limited number of media outlets, so usually a few television stations, a couple of major national newspapers dominated the media landscape. Now, this meant that any politician who was serious about gaining office had to gain the approval of an established party to run for office. They needed the approval of a major interest group to raise the money. And they needed the approval of major media outlets so they could get decent coverage. Their dependence on these important establishment institutions had consequences. It meant that politicians didn't just simply respond to where they thought voters were. They also had to respond to the establishment. The establishment, in this sense, had a restraining effect, and it meant that you had to work within the political system to gain positions of national prominence. Now, in some sense, you could say this system was not entirely inclusive, but it was pretty stable, and it was the heart of what constituted 20th century Western democracy, a system in which political competition was genuine, was real, but was nevertheless constrained by these institutions. Now, this establishment monopoly existed across Western Europe, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Sweden, Germany, Canada. But over the last several decades, establishments have been losing their monopoly over electoral resources, which means they're losing their power over politicians. In many democracies, established parties have lost their monopoly over candidacies, for example, thanks to the introduction of primaries, where voters now have a say in selecting candidates for political parties. Just consider, for example, the United States, which was one of the earliest countries to introduce primaries binding primaries back in the early 1970s. Historically, American political parties did a pretty good job of keeping out demagogic outsiders from important candidacies for office. This is important to remember because sometimes we kind of whitewash the history and say that these kinds of leaders didn't exist. But just to name a couple who are very prominent in American history in the 20th century, Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, was an avid fan of Adolf Hitler and wanted to be president in the 1920s. Huey Long, governor from Louisiana, who had really autocratic tendencies, also wanted to be president. Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin. George Wallace, a segregationist governor from the United States South. Gallup poll data going back to the 1930s shows that each of these figures were incredibly popular nationally, but none of them ever made it close to the White House. And one reason was that they were kept out through the candidate selection process. Political parties played a major gatekeeping role. Prior to 1972, American political parties filtered out these sorts of leaders. And so and what's often thought of as the smoke-filled back rooms of politicians and party gatherings that was not particularly inclusive, not particularly democratic, these leaders got together, or national leaders got together and would keep these kinds of figures far from politics. And so what this meant was that party leaders who knew these figures up close knew that they were dangerous and often kept them out. And so for all of its shortcomings, this old system, again, was not entirely democratic. It actually had a perfect record in keeping demagogues out of the top leadership positions for national office. So it was impossible for a figure like Henry Ford, even though he wanted to be president, to gain candidacy in one of the major political parties. Now, this changed, of course, after 1972, and in many ways I could think what happened in 2016 in the United States, when Donald Trump was selected as the Republican Party nominee for president, was a sort of the equivalent of as if Henry Ford had gained access. And what changed in particular was the introduction of these primary system, which weakened political parties' role as gatekeepers. It weakened the establishment. We see similar dynamic in European countries today as well. So in the United Kingdom, parties have opened themselves up through primary process to select their leaders. Even in Germany, the Social Democratic Party, historically highly centralized party, today has a system of voting to select its party leaders, and the German CDU does as well. So we have the weakening of party establishments. So that's one big development. A second big development is in the realm of interest groups. Interest groups have lost their monopoly over campaign finance because candidates in many democracies can increasingly raise money on their own. In the United States, this is most extreme. One kind of interesting fact I think that sometimes people forget is that in 2015, 2016, there was a primary race between Hillary Clinton, the consummate insider, and Bernie Sanders, the consummate outsider within the Democratic Party. And what's so striking is that the two candidates raised as much money as each other. And they did this in large part because Bernie Sanders could rely on outside, decentralized sources of funding. So this is a second development. The funding process of parties has opened up. And a third development is the emergence of social media, which has eroded the influence of established media institutions. So as we all know today, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media outlets allow candidates to reach voters even if they're shunned by the mainstream media. So my co-author, Steve Levitsky, visited Brazil, right before the election of Bolsonaro to the presidency in Brazil in 2018. And he met at the time with a lot of business leaders and so on who were backing the establishment center-right candidate. They all seemed to tell him at the time that because Bolsonaro was his party had essentially not a real party, even didn't really have much access to campaign or advertising time on television. So they were convinced that the establishment candidate would win. And because he had access to lots of television time, advertising time on the nightly news, they thought he was advantaged. What these figures had not counted on was the fact that Bolsonaro was relying on WhatsApp and YouTube to access his voters. And of course, using WhatsApp and YouTube, he was able to access the voters, circumvent the establishment media institutions. Similarly, in Germany today, the AfD has accessed social media institutions in a way that the establishment political parties have not. And so a reporter for a German magazine that I was talking to last year said to me that the AfD politicians don't do interviews with them anymore, and she said they don't even need us. The point is they have their own YouTube channel, they can access voters directly. So this means that the radical right in Germany dominates social media, and the establishment parties have been absent, and they're trying to catch up, I would say. So in summary, what all of this means is that politicians don't need the establishment as much as they used to. They can raise money online and reach voters via Twitter and Facebook. They can hijack political parties through primaries, and if they can't do that, they can simply found their own parties. Now, in some sense, you could say for outsider politicians, this can feel liberating. Freed of their establishment, their dependence on the establishment, outsider politicians can respond to where they think voters are, or try to create followers among voters directly without worrying about what the elite think. And in fact, they can campaign against the elite, or who they portray as the elite. So in the wake of the financial crisis last decade and the context of rising inequality, heightened racial and cultural resentments, there's always going to be a fair amount of demand for these kinds of politicians. There's always been this kind of demand, though. Again, remember that millions of voters wanted Henry Ford to be president back in the 1920s. What's new, what's happening today, I think part of my understanding of the crisis that democracies face today is that it's much easier to bypass what we can think of as the establishment, and even oppose the establishment. It's much easier to do that today than it was 50 years ago. Now, there's a paradox here, of course, right? Because in some sense, you could say this is more inclusive, or looks more inclusive. And politicians can be more responsive to voters. But it also leaves our democracies much more vulnerable to demagogues, many of whom, once in power, go on to assault democratic institutions. So again, this is a paradox. It's no surprise for anybody who knows Western European history and Western American history as well that elites used to hate democracy. In the 18th and 19th centuries, political elites were terrified of democracy, terrified of the masses. And Western elites really didn't accept democracy until the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, one thing that made that acceptance possible was the rise of counter-majoritarian institutions, which gave rise to what we today call liberal and representative democracy. But another factor, I think underappreciated, that made democracy safe for elites was the power of political establishments. Things like hierarchical party organization, powerful interest groups, media that provided guardrails to our politics. So these kinds of institutions provide serious constraints, in a sense, on democratic competition, and they transformed what could have been plebiscitary kind of democracy into a very much elite-centered democracy. The economist Joseph Schumpeter is often associated with this conception of democracy, a kind of competition among elites. And what we can think of as Schumpeterian democracy was in part engendered by the creation of these establishments. So 20th century democracy was profoundly Schumpeterian in a sense, and Schumpeterian democracy in turn relied on powerful establishments. But I think in many ways that era has passed. The establishment's gatekeeping roles and powers have eroded dramatically. And that change, again, is more inclusive in some sense, but it opens the door. So this brings greater inclusion, but at the same time, it leaves democratic institutions and democratic regimes more vulnerable to exclusivist kinds of tendencies. This is a kind of what I think of as a boomerang effect in a way. It's an unattended effect. So the question then is, how do we get out of this bind? That's the second half, I guess, in the parentheses here. So our democracies, of course, are premised on the notion of tolerance, inclusion. And so this raises a dilemma. Must we now also then tolerate and include forms of exclusion and intolerance in our democratic politics? This is a hard dilemma. Now, I think the good news is we are not the first generation of people to face this. We don't have to entirely reinvent the wheel. We're not the first generation of people to face the rise of these kinds of parties and movements that assault democracy from within. Now, the scale of the threat has varied, of course, between the 1920s, 1930s till today, but the essential dilemma remains the same. If one political party subverts the rules of the game of democracy, what is the proper response? History and I think other countries' experiences offer a bunch of possible lessons, and I kind of want to emphasize three possible answers to this dilemma. The first answer for dealing with this dilemma of these kinds of emergence of these kinds of movements comes from the lessons of the darkest days of democracy in the 1930s in Europe. And this is a method that emerged out of this period that you can think of as a method of containment, where left and right forces, democratic political parties who disagree on a lot, come together and join forces to defeat the outside anti-democratic forces. So this is a strategy I associate with the great Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, who was born in Weimar, Germany, but grew up in Spain during the Civil War and then went to Yale University to teach political science for many, many years. And one of his central points in his work, writing in the 1970s, looking both at the Spanish experience in the 1930s and Germany in the 1920s and 30s, is that politicians need to learn, and citizens need to learn to identify the types of political parties and groups that are threats to democracy. So in his 1978 book, he proposed a litmus test that he said citizens can use to identify threats. If a politician or a political party verbally attacks the Constitution, condones violence, attacks the legitimacy of his rivals, or regularly assaults basic liberties like freedom of the press, then alarm bells should go off. And Linz argues then what is necessary is that the democratic politicians and parties within the system have to launch a containment strategy, one that requires all forces, left and right, to join forces. Now, this actually was used quite successfully in certain instances in the 1930s in Britain. One could say the national governments in Belgium in the 1930s, Catholics and socialists who really hated each other joined together to defeat fascist forces. And in many ways, I think the kind of never-Trump movement of Republicans within the United States in 2020 represented this, where Republicans who considered themselves Republicans nonetheless mobilized and supported Joe Biden, thinking that Donald Trump, a Republican, represented a threat. So that's one strategy. And I'll come back to some of the weaknesses and strengths of this strategy. A second strategy for coping with authoritarians within a democracy also emerged out of after 1945, and this is the strategy that emerged out of West Germany, sometimes called streitbare, wehrhafte Demokratie, militant or defensive democracy. The notion was developed by Karl Lowenstein, a German political scientist who immigrated to the United States, to Massachusetts, and wrote an article in the 1930s in which he defined this. And the basic idea was that it's a dramatic mistake, Lowenstein argued, to allow fascists to fester in a political system and then to use that same political system to ascend to power. And the quote that haunted the advocates of militant democracy, like Lowenstein, was a quote from Joseph Goebbels himself, who infamously said after the Nazis were in power that, quote, "This will always remain one of the best jokes of democracy, that it gave its deadly enemies the very means by which it was destroyed." So in post-war Germany, German jurists and legal theorists embraced the idea of a militant democracy and incorporated this directly into the Constitution, in which certain articles of the German Constitution allow for a judicial process and a legal process to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable public debate, acceptable and unacceptable political parties, and the idea that political parties, in fact, can be banned after a legal process if they're deemed to be a threat to the Constitution. This has actually been used a few times in German history, in the 1950s in particular, and just the mere shadow of the threat is thought to contain these forces. Now, this model has been adopted, of course, in other democracies, Spain and elsewhere, and there's something to be said for it. So these two strategies, containment and exclusion, have certain appeals, but I would say there's also certain limitations. One, containment is a short-term emergency strategy. You can form these kind of big coalitions to get through a moment of crisis. But over the long run, political parties need to compete with each other. You can't have a permanent grand coalition to keep the bad guys out. And this undermines ultimately the legitimacy of a system. The exclusion model is also certainly appealing, but it also has some major deficiencies. One is that it's very easily abused. We only can think in the United States of FBI investigations of Martin Luther King and the kind of designating of political opponents as enemies of the state, and this can be very easily abused in the wrong hands. So there's also a third strategy, and I'll end with this strategy. I mean, I do think I should say those first two strategies, there's room for these, in any democracy, but they have to be used carefully. The third strategy, I think, is in some sense the liberal strategy, and it's the idea that competition is the great solution. Competition. So not exclusion, not containment, but competition. So since James Madison in the United States or John Stuart Mill in Britain, there's this notion in liberal political doctrine, which is that competition is the great elixir. So facing illiberalism, John Stuart Mill would advise us that we should let all opinions compete. It's a mistake to use, according to Mill, the threat of the physical force of the state to silence outrageous voices. The alternative, Mill said, was to allow the collision of adverse opinion, is the phrase he used. Now, this is also the way that I think many liberals in both Western Europe and the United States think of their own democracies as kind of great self-correcting machines, that competition should moderate. This is especially so in a two-party system, because in a two-party system, if you have one political party that really goes off the rails, if we assume that most voters are democratic, voters should punish them at election time. This is how it's supposed to work in theory. So, like a professional sports team, if you lose, you fire the coach, you acquire new players, you come up with a new strategy. The same should be true for political parties. And if you speak to never-Trump Republicans today who think that the fate of their party is, they're not happy with the current condition of their party, they'll often say this. You say, what needs to be done? They'll often say, my own party needs to lose repeatedly over and over until we learn our lesson. Now, there's a certain logic to it. But there's also a problem for this approach as well. And that is that competition might be undermined by exclusion. And waiting for the magic of competition to kick in, it's possible that authoritarians assault democratic institutions to such a degree that democratic institutions themselves become dysfunctional. So the self-correcting magic of the democratic marketplace doesn't work. So my own greatest fear about American democracy is exactly this. That authoritarian elements possibly within the Republican Party might alter the election voting process, and we see this happening in lots of states within the United States, making systems more exclusive, disenfranchising voters, and defanging this kind of self-corrective mechanism of democracy. In our constitutional structure in the United States, the Electoral College, the United States Senate, which allows parties to win power without actually winning majorities, only makes this worse. Because if politicians can gain power without having to appeal to most voters, the self-correcting logic breaks down. It becomes harder and harder to remove incumbents from power. If majorities aren't necessary to win office, then the self-correcting force of democracy fails. So this is a problem then as well, but this is, I think, a viable potential solution. So I think one way of thinking about the current crises facing American democracy is that this self-correcting logic isn't entirely working, because competition is being hindered in part by certain features of our Constitution. And I think it's really worth noting that when we look between the period of 2016 and 2021, we compare Western Europe to the United States. The United States is the only country, so the old democracies of post-45 Western Europe, where the United States is the only country where you had a genuine experience of democratic backsliding. According to all the international indices, America's score worsened. And so we have to kind of think about why has that happened in the United States, and why has, despite all of the challenges facing European democracies, they've actually survived this period with greater stability. And I think the fault in many ways lies not with the voters, but rather with our institutions. So let me just conclude then by saying, we live in an age of declining establishments. These dynamics of inclusion have paradoxically, though, opened the door to demagogic threats. And this leaves us facing these very difficult dilemmas with few easy answers. And I've pointed to three, but I've also pointed to the problems of each. These three solutions of containment, exclusion, competition, and I'm happy to hear if there's more. I can only count to 3, so I'll stop there. But each of these are imperfect in their own ways. But what's clear is that for scholars of democracy, for citizens living in democracy, these are the dilemmas we face today, and there's a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.
Yes, yeah, I think you need that. Well, we're going to open the discussion, have first a conversation with Daniel, and then open up to the public for questions. This is quite a topic, Daniel. You're touching really quite a central issue of our societies. And you seem to imply that indeed democracy is in crisis. And you are talking about the birth of democracy, of modern democracy, which is the United States. And you see quite concern about the current status of democracy in the US. We are facing presidential elections next year. As we know, Donald Trump is going to be the candidate of the Republican Party, and right now has the highest support. So all this leaves us with the question, can we save democracy?
I think so. I mean, I'm actually optimistic, fairly optimistic. And the main reason that I'm optimistic is that unlike earlier periods, I would say majorities of voters embrace democracy. I mean, sometimes we see these opinion polls that young people are disaffected and so on, but I think it's pretty clear that majorities of voters in all of our democracies are inclusive, tolerant, liberal in the kind of classical sense, want more open societies. And so in that sense, if voters are driving the story, then we should be optimistic. I think the problem is that our institutions often fail our voters. I mean, our institutions don't allow the voters to speak, because of various distortions that come about in different ways in different democracies, and because of the failure of institutions to deliver. So in that sense, at a fundamental level, I'm optimistic, but the question then becomes, how can we adjust our institutions and our political parties? And I think in every democracy there are different challenges. But at the end of the day, certainly I think democracy can be saved. Otherwise, I would get into another line of work.
So checks and balances and institutions which function, but also politicians which really respect the rules, and education to the larger public, because there is a need to be educated in the democratic values and democratic virtues, I would even say. How did it happen? Because there is a moment in which we see probably the financial crisis, the rise of populism afterwards, but there is a clear erosion in recent years of democracy. What is your analysis of what has happened?
Yeah, so I touched a bit on this on the talk, but I'm happy to elaborate more. I mean, I think at the essence of the democratic bargain, democracy is a bargain between government and citizens. And part of that bargain is that government will deliver to citizens in exchange for support for the regime. Democratic institutions and government will deliver the possibility of, at a very basic level, improved material conditions to people's lives. And for much of the post-war period in Western Europe, as well as in the United States, the assumption always was that your children would lead lives as good as yours, or at least as good as yours, if not better. And because of broad economic changes, really beginning in different times in different countries, this is no longer the case. Median wages have flatlined. Young people's lives are not, in some sense, you could think, going to be better than previous generations. And so that means the bargain has broken down. And so this leaves lots of people disaffected. And so that, one of the most spectacular single pictures, which I think capture our period, is a figure I once saw in The Economist magazine, which shows from 1945 to the present increases in productivity, average worker productivity, and it's kind of this straight line that goes up like this. And then mapped onto that, increases in the median wages of workers. And what you see is from 1945 to this was in the United States, but the same figure could be drawn for Western Europe as well. You see a figure mapping perfectly onto this. And then right about in 1981 in the United States, although productivity keeps going, median wages flatlines. And so that gap is the problem in some sense. So you combine that with the perception that societies are becoming more diverse and cultural changes, and this provides raw materials for demagogues who want to offer simple solutions to voters and say, there's a simple solution to this. You can blame the outsiders, blame those, don't blame yourself, blame others. And so these provide the raw materials that at some basic level increase the disaffection from democracy.
So you spoke about 3 possible solutions and their dilemmas. None of those, as you analyzed, are completely satisfactory. But we may need parts of those 3 solutions eventually. You were talking about wehrhafte Demokratie, militant democracy. But if we transform that, as we were discussing, on defensive democracy, is there a need for democracy to really defend itself against the groups that want to destroy it? I mean, this would have been probably in the Weimar Republic and in the interwar years a necessary means, really, to not only to contain, but to really put a blockade to the emergence of fascism and National Socialism. And you spoke also about containment. This, as you said, may be very unpractical in terms of you need to, have coalitions with the extremes, and sometimes the extremes contaminate the mainstream parties. But don't we need something of containment as well? So I would suggest that out of your 3 solutions, some parts of that may be working.
Yeah, I think we need all 3, in fact. I mean, so the point that convinces me most about militant democracy is the story about Hans Kelsen, the great German legal theorist who wrote the Austrian Constitution in the 1920s, and he was a very influential professor of law at Berlin, a liberal, who in 1932 wrote these famous words which haunt me, and I think should haunt all of us, in which he said, if you really believe in democracy, again, 1932 in Berlin, if you really believe in democracy, you should be willing to go down on the sinking ship and wait for another day to resurrect yourself. A year later, Hitler's in power.
Yeah.
And what happened to Hans Kelsen? He fled Germany and ended up living in Berkeley, California, where I studied and lived in the sunny hills of Berkeley, California, safe from Nazism. But, the point is you can't just sit and wait and hope that these problems solve themselves. I mean, there is an argument to be made that active steps need to be made to defeat these kinds of forces, and through the rule of law institutions. And so this means in the United States, finding a legal basis to say that those who participated in the attack on the Congress on January 6th need to be excluded from politics. I mean, finding a legal basis for this and a constitutional basis for this. And so I think certainly there's a need for that kind of strategy in our politics. But again, as I said, I think it's dangerous, and so we have to move very cautiously. And some mixture of all 3 of these strategies is necessary.
Do you think that we need more educational instruments? Instrument is not a very good word, but I remember Germany having done so much in terms of re-education, really, and the memories of what happened in history has been the best counterbalance to any antidemocratic sentiment or attraction.
Yeah. No, I do think that played a major role in Germany after 1945, and the role of what in the United States is called civics education, where school children are taught not only the importance of democratic values, but lessons from history and also democratic skills, how to participate in debates where you respect the other side. These are absolutely essential.
The part of the issue the reason I didn't mention, although I think they're very important, the reason I didn't mention them because in many ways this is the most slow-moving solution. This requires generational change. And I think it's absolutely necessary. And I think actually what's pretty clear, at least if I'm looking at surveys in the United States, the most liberal-minded generation on racial and ethnic questions in the United States is the youngest generation. And so my students, and younger than that, are people who have much more tolerant political views. And so that sense gives me kind of hope. I think there are kind of stirrings of kind of debates of intolerance, at all levels of society. But I think making sure that our citizens themselves are equipped and have the resources to deal with democracy is really important. And a final point on that is that, what's interesting in the United States is that civics education is sometimes treated as a luxury. And it's a luxury kind of good. And so the idea is that, schools with lots of resources that can afford to set aside time to teach this. And it's often schools in poorer areas where, this is impractical. People should learn skills, how to function in the economy. And what this means, though, is that if you think of these skills as a resource, these political skills as a resource, in some ways our political educational systems are reinforcing political inequality, giving some citizens the resources and the skills to be able to work in a democracy and others not. So I think clearly this is another kind of possible way of addressing our problems.
You said at some point that the destruction of democracy would be to transform rivals into enemies. The moment in which you don't respect your political rival, and as we have seen, in Trumpian era, for instance, the moment in which you have in face of you, somebody who you are attacking because you feel that he or she is your enemy, that's a moment in which you really are eroding, I would say, the frame and the grounds of democracy. But would you say that the experience of recent years has eventually now bring the clock to a more moderate, centrist sentiment among, I would say, parts of the electorate in Western countries, at least? Maybe also in the US, that eventually extremists will have now more difficulties to be elected president.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I think, this is working against these dynamics of polarization, where every facet of life is looked at through these partisan lenses. So, COVID, we normally think that, I used to think at least, when people would say, well, how do we get rid of polarization? They would say, well, you need a crisis, an external enemy, and people join together. An external enemy can come in the form of a war, or it can come in the form of viruses, public health threats. But what's so remarkable is that the COVID epidemic itself became a political issue, where if you're on the right, in the United States, you're more likely to think that it was not as big of a deal, and if you're on the left, you think it was a big deal. The war in Ukraine is often viewed very shockingly and through a partisan lens in the United States. So there are politicians, I think, and leaders who make a political living from fomenting these differences. And so they're working with a public that often, I think you're right, is not quite as extreme as the politicians portray it. And the politicians are working very hard to kind of divide people on these lines because there's political money to be made, political money, I put with quotes, to be made, a political profit, in a sense, to be made. So, I think because I think that most voters actually are quite liberal and so on, if we believe a public opinion polls, I hope, and I think the 2020 election in the United States was evidence of this, that some of these strategies don't work. And just one interesting kind of point of contrast, in 1972, when Richard Nixon was running for president for re-election, he made the race riots in the United States, where there was racial attacks in the streets and cities of the United States, and tried to scare white voters to support him, and said that these attacks are a threat to stability. You should vote for me, and I'll put an end to this. It was a very successful strategy because most voters actually were sympathetic to this message. In 2020, Donald Trump tried to use that same playbook again when the Black Lives Matter protests were in the streets of the United States, and he went around saying, this is a threat to stability, come vote for me and I'll put an end to this. And what was quite surprising, and good news, I would say, is that strategy didn't work in 2020. And I think that's because American voters, at least, on these kinds of questions of racial tolerance, have increased their level of racial tolerance. And so I think that shows that progress among citizens is possible.
So there is hope. There is hope.
There's hope, yeah.
Social networks, usually it is, being quoted as one of the factors of fragmentation, of polarization, even sometimes hate discourse. Again, this is a dilemma for liberals. Should we put limits on, hate speech in the social networks? Should there be, this has been quite a controversy in the US, we are aware of it, and it is quite a complicated matter. Should there be some sort of control?
Yeah, so I think there's a big misunderstanding about this, at least in the United States. I mean, it depends on the national legal context, the European legal context, but in the United States, there's this sense the First Amendment protects free speech. It does, but it doesn't protect private institutions and companies from limiting what happens in their own spaces. And so, there's this metaphor that some people use to say that Twitter and Facebook are the public sphere. And so if these companies limit what happens on these spaces, they're violating the First Amendment. And from my view, this is a mistake, because these are, in fact, private companies, and they can limit speech just as in any private setting, speech can be limited. It's only a violation of the First Amendment in the United States if the federal government restricts free speech. And so in this sense, I think, private companies can limit what they want. And I think, efforts to combat misinformation, these companies know that it's in, Twitter, until Elon Musk took it over, it's a different story now, but these companies, Facebook and so on, know that if their sites become sources of misinformation, then lots of people will turn away from them. So they have a financial interest in making sure that information ought to, be more accurate. So in some sense, I think it's good that these companies regulate themselves. It may not be sufficient, but I think the moment government gets in the position of having to regulate this, then this raises all sorts of trickier legal issues. But I think these companies should be allowed to, regulate this stuff as freely and aggressively as they want.
Maybe I may ask you a further question, then we'll open to the discussion. On the European Union and democracy in the European Union, of course, there is a long debate on how to increase democracy in the European Union. How is your sentiment about it? Because we may have been very critical about the democratic deficit in the European Union, but at the same time, if you see how Brussels works in terms of, presence of different interests of all sorts influencing the legislative process, if you see also, all channels which have been created, for instance, now with the Convention on the Future of Europe, in order to get the citizens given the suggestions and proposals. What is your sentiment, also as a maybe, outside observer and analyst?
Yeah, it's very tricky because, of course, the EU is not a nation state, and so the standard democratic criteria fit very poorly onto this. And so, on the one hand, one might say this is just an intergovernmental organization that looks like the United Nations or any other, so why ought one expect it to be democratic? But obviously it's more than that, but it's not yet really a fully democratic system. So I do think that one needs to think about the relationship of nation states and the European Union. And there have to be, and to think about what the consequences of the interaction between the two are for citizens. And so, if important domains of political life are taken out of the hands of national governments and put in the hands of the European Union, and these remain out of reach of citizens, then this has a negative effect on the quality of democracies and within nation states, and the quality of debate and the quality of things that can be discussed and debated. And this may, so if the most important policy questions are put in the hands of technocrats, then what does this leave national politicians to do but to, fight over highly symbolic and contentious and potentially destructive kinds of issues? And so, as long as these important policy issues, that things that citizens ought to have a say over, economic policy, other areas, are going to be decided at the European Union, then we need to think about ways in which citizens can influence that. Because in the end, the European Union won't suffer, it's national governments that will suffer because you'll have really kind of dangerous types of politics at home.
So the final question is about the role of the judiciary. This is different in different countries. I mean, in the US, or if we take European countries, it is really a clear pillar of the separation of powers. We see now in Israel also the attack on the judiciary. We have seen Poland, we have seen Hungary. But on the other side, in the US, there is also the discussion that the judiciary may be too politicized already. This is something that sometimes we have also here in Spain. Politicization of the judiciary, judicialization of politics. How would we escape from this kind of, bad engagement of the judiciary with politics?
It's a real balancing act, because democracy is more than just voters voting. It's also about constraints on power. So it's both about giving citizens access to power, but it's also about constraining power, whether that power's in the hand of monarchs or in the hands of citizens. And what the judiciary, in part, is intended to do is to carve out certain areas that are out of the reach of elections. Certain things ought to be beyond the reach of majorities. There's a famous Supreme Court decision in the United States in the 1940s where the Supreme Court justice said certain principles, religious liberty, for instance, being the one he was talking about, are beyond the reach of majorities. And that you can't have a democracy unless certain domains, basic civil liberties, are beyond the reach of majorities. And so what you see in a place like Hungary, or I think I would say in Israel, is an effort to reduce those areas. And so that's a threat to democracy. Now, the dilemma is that certain areas ought to be within the reach of majorities. And so the big debate in politics is to figure out, and the kind of central dilemma in democratic politics is to figure out which things should be within the reach of majorities and which things ought to be beyond the reach of majorities. And I do think that basic questions of public policy ought to be within the reach of majorities, but certain key principles that protect democracy, again, like civil liberties, individual freedoms, need to be beyond the reach of majorities. You can't use, temporary majorities. Somebody who has happened to gain a big majority, over 50% of the vote, can't use that temporary majority to entrench themselves in power. So if they reduce competition, then this is a threat to democracy. I think this is what's happened in Hungary over the last 10 years, 14 years. And so the judiciary then is, having an independent judiciary is necessary for that. I know some of my colleagues, think that the Supreme Court is such a threat to democracy in the United States that we should get rid of the Supreme Court, that everything should be decided by the Congress. And I think the comparative view would suggest that this is really short-sighted. There's obviously an important role for our independent judiciary, but there has to be some democratic accountability to it. And the main method of democratic accountability is through the process of selection of judges, and also having term limits or retirement ages for judges, because the United States actually is unique in this respect in not having term limits or retirement ages for federal judges. And so these judges can sit in their offices for 40. If a judge is appointed by Donald Trump at age 40, this judge will still be around 45 years later. And years from now, when life expectancy lasts longer, we'll have judges in their 90s still working. This is totally possible. And this has sometimes been described as the problem of the dead hand. So Donald Trump's presidency will continue to affect politics 40 years from now. And so this is an area where I think there could be more democratic accountability to make courts more directly linked to the present generation.
Very good. So we need reforms. At the end of the day, strong institutions, strong democracy, and reform of democratic systems. So, are there any questions?
It's a pleasure to hear you, but I regret to inform you, being from Venezuela, I can assure you the three strategies do not work. We've engaged not only in those three, but on another dozen strategies to try to first defend democracy and then reestablish democracy. we have gone beyond demagogy and poor democracy. We are now into a criminal state. And it is my understanding that our problem very much, it's way beyond Venezuela. This is not in our hands anymore. The criminal states operate as a bloc. It's a geopolitical issue now. Yet, democracies around the world do not orchestrate as such. So you have a criminal bloc, and then you have a very tolerant democratic bloc, including the European Union and even the United States, who have backed down on the sanctions towards Venezuela. So I wonder, when I hear extraordinary thinkers like Harari say that we have problems like we have global crime, but not global institutions, I wonder, shouldn't we be thinking about institutions, global institutions, that somehow force countries to engage in a minimum democratic establishment? Isn't this a dialogue we should be having?
By the way, we can also have questions in Spanish, and then las preguntas también en español pueden ser, por supuesto.
Right.
You want to answer to that?
Yeah, it's a wonderful point, and I think you're right that the international context is particularly important, and I think there's a way in which coming from an American perspective, there's a sense that because it's a big country and a powerful country that we're immune from these international forces. But I think it's very clear in the 2016 election, as well as the 2020 election, that there was efforts to affect the election outcomes. And I think these efforts will only become more severe. So you're right that there needs to be an international context. So thank you for the suggestion and the comment. I think one way, so earlier today we were meeting at the university, and somebody raised the question of the Summit for Democracies that President Biden proposed. And so this was an effort to bring democracies together to fight, to have a common front for democracy. And I would say it's largely not been a great success. It's only the very beginning stages of this. But the thing that I think gave rise to the period between 1990 and 2010, a period of incredible democratic growth, part of the thing that gave rise to Spanish democracy as well is the influence of the international context and encouragement of democracy and advocacy for democracy by powerful actors. And in a context in which China is rising as an alternative model, Russia emerges as a more assertive power, the importance for a commitment to democracy from democratic nations is even greater. And so the European Union has to play a more aggressive role in this, and the United States has to play a more aggressive role in this. And I think, Joe Biden has sort of been, the Biden presidency has been stuck in a way in a dilemma because, initially, and I think they still talk often about the world is divided between democracies and non-democracies, and that's right. But the problem is, in a way, that pushes all the non-democracies together, and it runs the risk of forming a counterpole, which now actually has in fact formed. But in some ways, there may be tensions among the non-democracies that we shouldn't overestimate the degree to which they actually want to cooperate. There's rivals and tensions there. So I think that's absolutely right, that this needs to be an agenda. And that's why I think forums like this, where people are talking across different countries, it's really important to recognize this.
I think there were some questions over there. Yeah. Allí. Perdón, sí, adelante.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Mr. Ziblatt. I'd like to emphasize again what an honor and a pleasure it is to have you here today with us. And as a student of both law and political science, I'd like to ask you one or maybe two questions. The first would be, what are some of the potential implications of the rise of China and other authoritarian powers? I think in the last question you mentioned this. And how can these threats be addressed? And the other question would be if international institutions and global actors can play a significant role in addressing these or these kind of issues, or if they have been effective in recent years. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I do think one important, so in addition to what I just said, I think there's a more active role and a commitment to democracy. Maybe I'll just elaborate the point that it's easier to be an autocrat today than it was 15 years ago. And by that I mean the price that a country pays in embracing non-democratic governance strategies is lower, I would say. I mean that in a sense, it's important for the European Union and the United States to make countries pay a price if they're non-democratic. And so in the European Union, this is clearly the case. If you have member states that are not democratic, they have to pay a price for this, and this is a way that the European Union can use leverage, the leverage that it has. But in addition to that, I think we need to make the case among our own citizens of the value of democracy, the degree to which democracy is preferable to autocracies. There's sometimes a tendency to idealize the Singaporean model. And, I've been to Singapore. It's a lovely place. It's a society that seems to work pretty well. But, we shouldn't assume that every country that abandons democracy is going to look like Singapore. There's a lot of autocracies where systems don't work, politics don't work in a way that anybody would want to live in. The corrupt criminal states is not, where you have arbitrary use of power with no accountability is something that most people don't want to embrace. And so, democracy has the advantage. One of the things that, sometimes democracies or autocracies look very strong, and that's partly because they're not very transparent. And so we don't see all of the internal fights taking place. I mean, it's kind of like looking into your neighbor's window and they have the shades drawn closed, so you don't really see what's happening. You look into another neighbor's window and the shades are open, very transparent. This is what a democracy is. And so people look to democracies and they see all the fights, they see the populace, they see, the disputes, protests, conflict in the streets, polarization, and you might think, okay, I can underestimate this system is non-functional. But what you're actually witnessing when you see this, because the windows are drawn open, is a system of self-correction underway. I mean, we see democracies trying to address their problems, people expressing their disaffection, dissatisfaction, and democracies trying to respond to these. This is, again, I think the thing that we should embrace about democracies, they're capable of self-correction. It's messy, it's ugly, but it's pretty effective in the long run. And this is also why, I should say, with the countries with their shades drawn closed, this is why it often happens that autocracies look very strong one day, and the next day they collapse. If you think back to the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and the USSR, in 1986, 1987, 1988, there was no expert of the Soviet Union who thought the system would collapse in 3 years. And it's because we didn't really quite see all of the internal problems. And so, this is why autocracies collapse overnight. Democracies collapse slowly because if they don't address their problems, then they get into trouble. But I think, we have to recognize that democracies have this incredible power and advantage of self-correction. And so the response to your question, how do we deal with this internationally? I think recognizing these strengths and understanding that the so-called crisis of democracy may be a sign of democracy's self-correcting.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Good evening. I believe at the beginning of your speech, you mentioned Le Pen among some other leaders or candidates who could be considered as democrats. But my point is, can we establish an analogy between an extremist ideology and non-democratic? Because as far as I know, Madame Le Pen is not proposing non-democratic practices such as Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu are doing. But which is the point which allows us to consider a non-conventional proposal, such as Le Pen's, as non-democratic, so long she follows the rules we have established. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I got the question, and if I did, I think I like the point that you made, which is that it's important that not all extremist politics is anti-democratic politics. And extremism means out of the mainstream. If that's what extremism means, it can be a force for democracy. The advocates to eliminate slavery in the 1830s or 1850s in the United States were considered extremists, but these were the true Democrats. The people marching in the streets for the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and the 1960s, being arrested by police officers and beaten by police officers, were regarded as extremists. But again, these were the advocates of democracy. So extremism itself is not the problem. The question, so we have to distinguish between what's out of the mainstream and what what is a violation or an attack on democratic institutions. And I cited Juan Lin's earlier, and I think he does provide us this framework. And I mentioned a little bit of it in my talk. You know, if you have within a democracy politicians who don't accept elections, who want to use violence to achieve their goals, who treat their rivals as enemies, who attack free institutions like the media is illegitimate. If you have politicians who engage in this kind of politics, I think this is beyond the pale. This is anti-democratic. And so again, it's very important to distinguish between pro-democratic politics and anti-democratic politics. And it's not about are you in favor of higher taxes or lower taxes? Are you in favor of a single healthcare system for the country or private healthcare? These are policy debates that are perfectly legitimate to have. But the basic rules of democracy with democratic principles, from my view, should not be up for debate.
So further questions?
Yes, thank you very much for your intervention. It was really inspiring. Whenever I read articles or listen to lectures about the threats to democracy, I have the feeling that the underlying message is that the threats come from the right and not from the left. And looking at Venezuela and other Latin American countries, beyond Bolsonaro, of course, and even the woke cancellation movement in your country, in universities in your country, I wonder whether the challenge comes also from the left. I don't know what you think. I'm willing to listen.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's many ways to die, and there's many ways for democracies to die. And certainly the challenge can come from the left. I mean, the European history is filled with examples of this. I think contemporary Latin America as well. And the threats look differently in different places. That's why it's important to come up with these kinds of criteria that are not ideological, about violence, accepting elections, not trying to consolidate power once you're in power and attack democratic institutions, because I think both left-wing forces and right-wing forces are vulnerable to this. I think on the other hand, it is true that in the United States today, from my view, and I think for the most part in Western Europe as well, even if there's populists on the left and populists on the right, the major threats seem, at the moment at least, this won't always be the case, to come from the right. It's an interesting question. Why is that the case? And there's, it's hard for me to really have a single answer for that. In some sense, maybe the left was much more discredited. The communist left was much more discredited with the collapse of communism. I'm not sure what the reason is, but at the current moment, that's the case. But I think the same strategies of containment, exclusion, ought to work. And so, the 1950s, the German government both banned the Communist Party and a post-Nazi party. There are these threats to democracy from the left in Italy in the 1970s. So this is possible that these threats can come from this side. But that's why, again, it's really important to have these kind of clear criteria for what constitutes a threat and that it's not ideological.
We may take a couple of more questions. Yes, please.
Good evening.
Sorry.
Professor Ziblatt. This is Professor Olga Gil from Universidad Complutense, Professor of Political Theory. I want to thank you for your very interesting talk and the session of questions with Professor Venetio. And I wanted to ask you, if I understood you well, a little bit about how could we make more responsible the courts towards the young generation? What sort of ideas you have thought about this?
Well, yeah, it may vary. The solutions may vary from country to country, and I would love to learn more about the Spanish debate about the courts. But I think one problem is this problem that I called, again, the problem of the dead hand, which is which is the idea that these judges can serve for as long as they want. It's a little bit like the only other people in society who are able to do this are professors with tenure. So this is a problem for an institution that is supposed to be democratic. It may be a problem for professors too. But of course, as professors get older, they tend to think it's less of a problem, probably. And I think similarly for judges, as they get older, they think this is less of a problem. One of the interesting things about getting older is that you just think other people are getting younger, that you're staying the same age, right? So, but seriously, I think the problem in the United States is the absence of term limits and retirement ages. And so, there's a famous story in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt was trying to pass his New Deal, and the Supreme Court kept blocking it. At some point, he realized that all of the judges on the Supreme Court had finished their legal educations in the 19th century. And so it's this group of old men who didn't understand the world who were blocking his proposals. And I think similarly in the United States today, there's a concern that the members of the Supreme Court in the United States are increasingly old, and as life expectancy grows, this means there's a growing gap. And the idea of the problem of the dead hand is that the past keeps reaching forward. And so this creates problems of legitimacy. So one way is to make sure that there are term limits and retirement ages. But that's not a solution that will help Spain, because this kind of already exists in Spain. But there has to also be some sense that judges are in touch with the problems facing people. And I think this is a fine balance, because it's very easy to politicize the courts, which I think is dangerous. I think judges need to somehow be perceived as being above politics, but on the other hand, at least of our era. And so I think that's the most important point.
So I think we have a final question over there.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Ziblatt. My question is, it was very compelling the way that you described that part of the reason why these anti-democratic movements are coming into play is through the weakening of these three elements: the parties, the interest groups, and the media, the traditional media. And I was wondering why, if you have any thoughts as of why traditional democratic parties, politicians, haven't been able to adapt to these weakening of these three elements, and if there's any, if maybe the fact that they have been very used to this institutionalized gatekeeping, it's hard to adapt to this new movement and this new situation. And do you have any thoughts about that? Thank you.
I don't have a good answer. I think it's a great question for research. But as a scholar of comparative politics, I always think of these questions comparatively, because some democracies have been able to cope with this better than others. And so if we compare just in the realm of parties, if you compare the Italian party system to the German party system today, it's pretty clear that the post-war parties, and these are two similar democracies in a sense, created after 1945 in the wake of fascism and Nazism, the German parties have been able to adapt to a much greater degree. The CDU and the SPD, even though they have the traditional parties have a diminishing share of votes, they still are largely the dominant actors. In Italy, of course, you've had a complete disintegration through the corruption scandals of the Christian democracy and the decline of the left. You have a complete fragmentation of the party landscape. And just as a kind of as evidence for my thesis, I think that the fact that German democracy is more stable today is in part connected to that. Why these parties have maintained their hold on voters still? When you go to Germany, I think Germans are often concerned that the parties don't have their hold on voters, but I would say comparatively speaking, they do a pretty good job of it. One of the things, I guess the one idea I would say is that parties need to meet voters where they really lead their lives. And so social democratic parties were based in labor unions. Christian democratic parties were based in religious faith communities. As society secularizes, as labor unions decline, then you have a kind of professionalization of politics that's very removed from where people lead their lives. And so I think parties need to be able to remake themselves in a way that's compatible with where actually people lead their lives today. The problem is that most people lead their lives, looking at their phones. And so that's really tricky to figure this out. And so I think the revitalization of civil society institutions, the revitalization of unions are really important. And just, the degree to which workplace, people living in their workplaces in Germany, kind of workplace democracy still actually matters, where you have representation of workers in the decision-making process. I mean, I think there's actually some pretty good evidence that people who participate in workplace democracy are also more likely to participate in politics in election time. And so I think a lot of this has to do where people work and making sure that politics is relevant to where people live their lives today.
So great, a lot of things to be done, reform, rejuvenation, revitalization, innovation. So democracy needs new ideas.
Yes.
We enjoyed very much talking to you, your talk, you enlightened us. Thank you very much for being with us. And you won certainly a big applause from all of us.
Thank you.